So what's like the biggest issues you see right now with e-commerce platforms and SEO?
That's a good point. Yeah. So still crawl control is still definitely huge, right? You are right. Platforms are becoming much more search engine friendly. Like Shopify is doing, like they've done a ton to that platform to really like help out. They're starting to like democratize commerce in that way, and those sites generally are less of like a crawling mess, right? But we still see a ton of legacy systems where it's like, yeah, they have a huge faceted navigation, and you go into the index coverage report and see Google is able to crawl through all sites, all of these different combinations of URL, right? So how do you control that? Like, we generally take a more conservative approach when we see that, and it's like, okay, cut off crawl to all the irrelevant pages. Then you can start to do the Wayfair type of approach where you start to allow Google to crawl like the individual facets. Crawl control is still definitely big, or like Google just like not respecting the technical signals that you're like sending, right? So Google like basically,
Well, how do you define irrelevant pages?
It's a good question. So irrelevant pages would be pages that really aren't tied to a keyword that you want to be ranking for. A keyword that is a duplicate or a similar variant off of a page that already exists, right? And a page is also not too deep. That's also not too specific, right? So if you're going back to the Wayfair example, like couches would obviously be a relevant page. If you select blue, blue couches would be a relevant page, and then maybe you'd select plaid. So blue plaid couches might be a relevant page, but then
how do you define? Because it was funny. I used to joke in the early days. One of my early blog posts was a blog post about, I think, a big blue pineapple, I don't know, something like a outdoor chair, and that's what I wanted to rank for. Back then, ranking for big chair alone was easy, but ranking for big blue pineapple wooden chair was crazy easy because it was long tail. But pre-Panda, everybody went for the long tail. It was just glorious because people would search for those things. They would search for exactly what they want. But now if you search exactly for what you want, you don't necessarily want that page ranking.
Yeah.
Right? So how do you define, like, you went down from, I don't know, whatever, blue widget to blue widget with this feature, how far do you want to go? I guess it depends on traffic or not?
Depends on, so yeah, I guess that's probably the thing you need to reverse engineer. You need to do a keyword. Before you do any technical changes, you start with the keyword research. You need to do your keywords research first and see, okay, if I'm an e-commerce site, what variants are people searching on? Like a good rule of thumb is people search on color, right? Especially in the fashion space, in the furniture space. People not rarely, but not a ton search on price, right? Like people don't search on price. So in general, you might want to allow your color facets to be indexed, but you might not want your pricing facets to be indexed because people don't really.
What is the price? Like $10 versus cheap, or?
Yeah, specific like numerical values, right? And oftentimes you don't want like in some industries it depends, but like oftentimes when we see is we don't see a ton of search volume around that, at least compared to our sizing. Sizing is another thing people search on, right? People want like, the bad example, but like a large sectional or something, right? Or like a medium-sized shirt. So it depends on your industry and how much relative volume there is there. Also depends on like how well in my opinion, also depends on how well you think you can rank for competitive keywords. If you think you can rank for competitive keywords, then you might not develop a strategy around going around the super long tail. But conversely, if you're a small niche Shopify site, like, then you might just form your strategy around going more for the long tail, right? So like where it's like, hey, we sell, very specific comforters, right? So like that's the strategy you might develop going more to the long tail. But I guess the quote unquote rule of thumb would be maybe if once you've defined like more than two facets, you're maybe a little too long tail, like at that point. But it's so gonna vary depending on the site. But that's also what makes it like super interesting.
And how do you do with pagination on those pages, or you're just scrolling? It doesn't matter.
See, I'm old school. I like I did a post about this recently. I like linking hard pagination 1, 2, 3. Maybe and then the end, and then maybe and then the middle. I think there was someone. I wish I knew who did this post, but someone did a post where they visualized the pagination crawl.
Right.
I think it was someone from Important, if I'm not mistaken.
Okay.
And then they found if you link to the middle of the series, that also just like significantly improves the crawl, because now not only can Google start at the beginning and the end of the pagination, it can start in the middle and start accessing pages from kind of like all around. So like I like hard pagination. Infinite scroll I think is becoming more popular because because the UX makes sense, because we're all very on Instagram,
Right.
TikTok, whatever. I think that also just makes it harder to find products, right? If you have a product on page 8, it's harder just to scroll all the way down.
If you remember it was on page 8, you just go back to page 8 and you try to look for it there.
Right, and you could just more quickly go. But obviously, there's ways to set up, infinite scroll, crawling, right, where you can basically use push state, and you need to make sure your URL changes in the browser. But even then, Google actually recommends like some form of like you need to actually link as a URL somewhere in the DOM to the next page, so Google can actually see the next page. Because we have clients where it's like, they've used infinite scroll, URL never changes, right? It's like ESPN's like a good example of a site that does it like pretty well from what I remember. Is when you scroll down an individual article, like that URL will change as you scroll down.
Interesting. Okay, so the crawl control is very important. You make sure to get those irrelevant pages out. Number of facets is a factor there. There's also all the problems with technical parameters being in the URLs that you kind of strip out or canonicalize.
Yeah. So once again, depends on the setup. But like, if you must put on URL parameters, right, for whatever case, like generally the thought process is to canonicalize back to the root. Is once again the standard, not always the best advice. It just depends on what you're trying to do, right? But oftentimes, what you don't want to avoid is is Google crawling all those facets and having Google have self-referential canonical, so Google can crawl all those. Images, I think, are also becoming. I always thought like, when I started in SEO, I thought images were kind of, I don't know, so like soft, like, maybe it's like, images are important, everyone says it. Now I really believe images are like way more important. Like Google was,
especially for e-commerce.
Because Google was making those SERPs so like image heavy.
They look like shopping cart pages.
Yeah, and you've written about it so many times. Like I would love to see a diagram of all the search engine, all the search engine land, search engine roundtable, like articles you've written about all the e-commerce changes that have been made, right? Like Google's done so much with them, because they're really trying to compete with Amazon, and like that's their big problem.
Right. Cool. Yeah. So those are the top 3 from you. One thing I found was interesting is this lens feature and how Google's pushing more search via camera.
Yeah.
Especially with e-commerce.
Yeah.
I think I'm reporting about tomorrow or today. I forgot what the date is going to be. But basically, I think it was today. Basically, I was scrolling through some other feature that I was looking for. It was e-commerce related. I think it was searching for Converse sneakers and stuff like that. And Google's like, why don't you use camera search? Here's a button. I'm like, and that was a snippet. It looked like a search result.
Yeah.
But it was like pushing that. I'm like, it's such a great feature.
Yeah.
Especially they're pushing us so much for search by picture, search by camera. For Google Lens, I think 3D images and 360 images are. I think all that stuff is really, really important when it comes to e-commerce, and it's less about, I think these days, if you have a good platform and a good SEO, about making sure the platform does a really good job in terms of making sure the technical SEO aspects are done.
Right.
But going beyond that, like you said, images, content, 3D images, giving people a way to place the image in an AR environment. Google has AR images these times, so it's pretty amazing to see what you have to do. It used to back in the old days, throw a bunch of text on a page, get it out there, let Google crawl as much as possible, and don't worry about it. Now it's about like, all right, you did all the basics, you got to go above and beyond, and that's where I think the real value in terms of hiring an SEO company these days is making sure they provide that value.